Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening. I guess it depends on when you're watching this Zoom presentation. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the influence of evidence-based practice on social work and on other counseling professions, as well as on the supervision of frontline practitioners. A growing body of federally funded research has been helpful. It's identified which models offer advantages in dealing with specific populations, particular problem. They come under the rubric of evidence-based practice, or EBP, or evidence-supported practice, ESP, and they've been used to describe frameworks that have been exposed to some level of rigorous testing, whose findings offer some support for their use in practice. Public and private agencies are increasingly searching for practice models that they feel can offer some evidence of effectiveness with their population, if nothing else that could affect their funding. As a result, supervisors have been asked to become aware of these models and to incorporate them into supervision and the practice of their frontline workers. Although EBP may represent an advance for the helping profession, moving to a more, quote, scientifically based practice approach, the effort is not without some problems and controversy. For example, the decision to move to the use of a particular evidence-based practice may come from the top down without appropriate involvement of all staff. I've called this listen and do approach to administration and supervision. Listen to what I say and then just do it. This can create resistance to incorporating even a helpful approach. There have been many reports of settings instituting an EBP through training of supervisors and workers, and then finding that the new model lasts for only a number of months or a year, and then the workers go right back to do what they were doing before. Why is this? I believe it is due to a basic problem, what I call an artificial dichotomy, between science, like an EBP, and our individual and personal approaches to helping clients. I'm going to try to make the case in this video that science should free our artistry and not restrict it, which is often what happens with a mandated protocol. I will also try to describe and illustrate how we can take helpful elements from an EBP and incorporate them into our existing models of practice. So this is not a rejection of evidence-based practice. It's a question about how we use it. First, let me start briefly with some of the problems associated with mandated protocols. Conflicts can emerge when an EBP approach is mandated for all clients and a strict regime that requires the following of all protocols is established. It takes away from the workers and from you, the supervisors, the ability to adapt an EBP to the particular population, to the problem area, to the setting, or even specific clients, where such adaptations might be appropriate and helpful. Even when a collaborative administrative approach between administrators and staff introduces new models, and even a degree of flexibility is supported, the research shows that sustainability may still be a major problem. A move to a new model may even be greeted with enthusiasm and support, but it requires special efforts to maintain this practice over time. Supervisors and staff who may already feel overwhelmed with their workload are not always able to give the attention needed. Second is the question, is it really an EBT? Now, not all models identified as evidence-based practice actually meet the standard requirements and definitions associated with such an assessment. That's why it's important for agency administrators, supervisors, frontline workers to be able to evaluate the basis of the designation of a particular model. Another approach which I advocate is to use some of the specific ideas and interventions in EBPs by considering carefully how each can contribute insights and address a particular practice issue. For example, in my own practice with clients, supervision, teaching, I use what I've described as an interactional model as a general practice framework. I find it easy to draw upon ideas from all of the existing EBPs and some models that have not reached that level of acceptance, and to try to incorporate them into my approach to practice. As long as the underlying assumptions are similar and the approaches to ethical issues compatible, I use whatever seems to work, without regard for rigid compliance to the established protocols. I'm more interested in what helps the client than whether or not I'm implementing an EBP with rigor in its implementation. This is a controversial view, and supervisors in an agency adopting elements of a model will have to consider its relevance and appropriateness. Third, let me briefly address manualized interventions and dosage integrity in EBP research. It is common to develop a manual that provides a structure for the practitioner to guide the implementation of a particular model. In multi-site research projects, manuals are used to ensure what they call dosage integrity. It means that everyone at every site is delivering exactly the same model. However, the strict observance of the model and the manual in practice may, in some situations, prevent the use of innovative interventions or responses to unexpected events in the group. In an example of this, I observed parenting groups that were part of a national 16-site federally funded project designed to use groups to prevent intergenerational transmission of substance abuse. Group leaders were instructed to deliver parenting information at fixed times in a group session and for a required amount of presentation. The group sessions were videotaped, the tapes analyzed, and they checked to see if what they called dosage integrity was maintained when compared to the other sites. The rigidity of this manualized approach led the group leaders, in this case, to ignore parenting issues emerging from the group members, as well as to ignore signals of reluctance on the part of some of the mandated parents who sat there with their arms folded and clear expression on their face that they weren't happy to be here. The group would have benefited if the manual could have been adapted to the particular needs of the population and allowed the group leaders to address obvious resistance. Finally, I'd like to illustrate the discussion thus far by using three widely used evidence-based practices: motivational interviewing, MI, solution-focused practice, SFP, and cognitive behavior treatment, CBT. I'll review briefly the concepts and interventions as an introduction to the model. I'm then going to provide an example of how some of these concepts and interventions can be integrated into a different core model of practice or implemented with the practitioner's unique artistry. For example, motivational interviewing. The idea there is to build a framework for the stages of change model. Prochaska and DiClemente, I cite them. They cited 6 stages in the change process. The stages were pre-contemplation, contemplation, determination, action, maintenance, and relapse, and then moving back into action. I'm not going to go into detail on each one. They're fairly self-describing. In this model, the counselor uses interventions that are appropriate to the stage of change presented by the client. The counselor would not expect clients, for example, to begin to discuss actions to deal with a particular problem they were facing if they're still in pre-contemplation or even contemplation stage. Take the example that follows. A group leader, a woman, in a court-mandated driving while intoxicated group of men, recognized that the group members were in the pre-contemplation stage. This group leader was using the mutual aid model of group work, the one that I advocate, and the group member did not attack, as you will see, the members' angry assertions in the first sessions. They were not alcoholics, should not be forced to attend the group. If the leader had done that, as often happens, there would be a battle of wills going on. And it would really get nowhere, or people would create an illusion of work. They would say what they thought the group leader wanted to hear, not really do the work. Instead, she worked with the resistance, having members detail the things they did not want in the group, such as being called alcoholics, being made to feel guilty. Now here, this is an example where you intervene with a certain artistry in the particular way that she did it. Here's an excerpt from the recording, the process recording. This is in the words of the group leader. After going over the contract, I passed out a sheet that stated the purpose of the group and the topics to be covered. Some group members appeared to be reading the topics, others folded the sheet in half without a glance. I asked the group how they felt about the topics and if they had any question. After a moment of silence, one group member angrily stated, I shouldn't even be here. I was set up. Nervous laughter from the other group members. He proceeded to tell his arrest story, while other group members appeared attentive. Now, in some cases, this would be the point where the group leader, not using a motivational interviewing framework, understanding pre-contemplation, might challenge him and start to say, well, if he wasn't an alcoholic, why was he arrested, et cetera, and it would end up being a battle of wills. Instead, this group leader said, it must be hard for you to be here when you don't even feel that the arrest was justified. I wonder if other people are feeling the same way. Now, this is a very important intervention because instead of treating this guy as the, quote, deviant member and a problem, she understood that he might be speaking for the other group members, an internal leader. After she opened up the invitation, another member spoke up saying, well, I don't understand why we're going to talk about things like alcoholism and AIDS in a class for drunk drivers. He's referring to the handout. Yeah, we made one mistake and now we're all alcoholics. Other group members joined in, expressing similar dissatisfaction with the topic. I replied, again, not getting into a battle with them, I replied, you're raising important points. It sounds like one of the things you're especially concerned about is being labeled. I wonder if we can come up with a list of some of the things that you don't want to happen in the group. Now, this is really an astonishing change. And this is where I think the artistry comes in. So instead of attacking the resistance, she's going to work with the resistance. As I wrote on the board, don't want, and under it put to be labeled, I asked members for other suggestions. Another member said, I don't want to feel guilty. I don't want to feel guilty for what I did. As I wrote to feel guilty on the board, I asked him if he could say more about this. He responded, I mean, I know it was wrong, but I don't want to have people keep telling me it's wrong. Another member added, yeah, I feel like a criminal. Another member jumped in and says, well, we are criminals. What do you expect? Another member commented, I asked, is it hard to see yourself in that way? And one member said, yeah, well, I guess we are criminals, but there are worse things we could have done. What's so interesting is the list of don't wants actually matches each of the topics on the outline she handed out that they had crumpled over and thrown away. That's an example of the pre-contemplation stage. Let me take another minute and give an example of a similar group in the contemplation stage. They had moved into the contemplation stage in preparation for a transition to the action stage. One man, the deviant member, Phil, holds out, refuses to engage. The leader misses his early signals and sees him as an enemy to the group. Internal leaders often emerge to help both the man and the leader understand the behavior as a signal of intense pain and guilt associated with the traumatic event. Second session, the group was struggling with their denial. Tom was starting to open up, but Phil kept interrupting and sabotaged the movement of the group. It does appear that Phil is the gatekeeper. For every time the issue of drinking and driving is brought up, he tries to prevent the process from occurring. I encouraged Tom to speak about his drinking and driving. Tom started talking about how he had 3 arrests in 1 year for drunk driving. I asked Tom if he could share with the group how he feels about this happening. He started to speak, but Phil jumped in and said no one wanted to hear the story. I told Phil that Tom has the floor and asked him not to interrupt. I'm starting to get upset that Phil is constantly interrupting, but I hope someone else will take a risk and say something. Now, again, if we understand this as the contemplation stage, not ready for the action stage, and if that group leader understood a very basic concept from the interactional model, the mutual aid model, he would have understood that he had to be with Phil and with the group at the same time. But he's not doing that at this session. He's identifying with the group. At this point, this is when Phil leaves. The leaders help the most. Third session, when I think the group is starting to make progress, the illusion of work is holding members back. I make a demand for work, saying we are to discuss, maybe we need to discuss triggers that cause them to drink. Jim speaks up and asks what I would mean by a trigger. Pete answers, that was the Lone Ranger's horse. Tom jumps in and says, that's what you shoot a gun with. I'm not sure if the humor is a defensive tool to change the subject. I reply, the subject may have hit a sensitive spot, so I asked the group for feedback. Phil says Jim asked the dumbest questions and wonders how Jim ever got his license. Not the first time Jim was attacked. I am feeling Jim is being scapegoated. I ask why they feel it's necessary to do this. Pete, the internal leader, makes a leap of consciousness and apologizes to Jim for acting the way he did. Tom, Sam, and Phil all say the same. Pete continues and said he has never considered anyone's feelings before and asked me why. I open it up to the group. One member who's been noticeably quiet, Bob, speaks for the first time since the first session. And he says it has to do with the topic of the day, triggers. Bob says everyone has triggers that can set them off, but he sees triggers as coming from the past. He lived with an alcoholic and abusive home. I was taken aback by Bob speaking up and what he had to say. And the discussion goes on as they talk about having to overcome their fears in order to be able to talk into the group. We are now well into the contemplation stage, getting ready to make the move, but we still have Phil. This is the last session I'll read to you. I told the group that the last session showed the group was moving and they should feel good about the work they've accomplished. I had a feeling there was more work to be done with triggers, so I brought this out to the group. Pete said he'd done some thinking over the week and wanted to know if the group could help him. All responded yes, with except Phil. Tom asked Phil why he wouldn't. Phil said he didn't want to talk today. Bob jumped in and said he thought Phil was struggling with his own triggers and asked Phil if the group could get back to Phil not wanting to talk after helping Pete. Phil, in a quiet, subdued voice, said okay. Peter said he wanted to revisit triggers because he feels that's his major stumbling block. Discussion was fruitful. The group began to take on a life of its own, dealing with intimacy and interpersonal relationships. Bob, Pete, and Sam were willing to look at these issues, while Phil and Tom still seemed to be resisting further intimate movements. At that point, the group went back to Phil not wanting to talk, and Sam showed empathy and caring by saying that maybe Phil has some painful memories that have been triggered. The group as a whole struggled about how to help Phil. It seemed the group had finally found a common ground to focus on triggers. Other members took turns expressing how they've been affected by the triggers, how alcohol had taken over their lives, and the consequences. Bob talked about how he had lost his job. Sam said he lost his job and his wife divorced him. Pete said he had to go through bankruptcy. Jim finished by saying he had to spend 8 months in jail for his drunk driving and how that this affected him and how his children see him now. There was a lot of expressed emotion, all the members sitting in the chairs, all leaning forward towards one another as a way to begin to connect to the pains they had experienced as alcohol and due to alcohol. They now turned to Phil, who looked like he'd seen a ghost, and asked if he was ready to share his triggers. Phil said at first he thought this group was foolish. He felt that everything was under control. We all sat with Phil's emotions. And now I have a little trouble getting through this part of it every time I read it. He started to cry, saying that he had, for the first time since coming to the group, realized he was not alone in his fight over alcoholism. He said he felt this was a place for him to finally talk about the haunting nightmare. We all waited patiently. I was overcome with the power of the group. Phil said his trigger for all his years was drinking, was he was never able to forgive himself for driving in the car and getting in an accident that killed his wife. The group all sat in silence and cried for Phil and their own losses. Every time I read that excerpt, I feel this way, full of emotion. When I do a workshop, and I'm using examples like this, when I go home, my wife is going to ask me almost all the time, at what point in the workshop they just start to cry? How could you not feel the emotional impact? And that's a good example, I think, of where motivational interviewing, that phase of work, understanding pre-contemplation, contemplation, moving into action, helps to guide you in another framework, which is the mutual aid model. Let me briefly talk about solution-focused practice. Clients are believed to be competent regarding the shape they're in when they're entering therapy, and the role of the counselor is to help the client recognize the resources they already possess. Put simply, the worker thinks about what is right with the client rather than what is wrong. Interventions focus on the present and what clients bring with them to the process. Achieving behavioral change takes place and affects the present rather than resolving problems of the past. Not that at times you don't have to go into a more intensive therapy in order to address problems of the past, such as Phil's example in the previous excerpt. And clients have to be helped to think about what the future would be like if they were unstuck. One of the techniques that's very helpful is you ask about exceptions. You ask the member to begin to examine when the problem did not occur in the past. What conditions created those exceptions? For example, after a client in a substance abuse program discloses a relapse, the worker would ask, you relapsed, you started drinking again at least 3 times over the past 5 years, but you've been able to maintain your recovery for longer and longer periods. What was going on the time you maintained your recovery and how were you able to do it? A variation on this question would be to ask about times when the problem was not that serious or severe or less frequent or lasted a shorter time. The goal is for it to reinforce those factors that make a difference. This is a subtle but an important shift from focusing on the problem to identifying potential solutions. I ran a program which had groups for students who were suspended from school for violence, substance abuse, etc. This was in Buffalo when I was the dean at the School of Social Work at the University of Buffalo. What we would do is we would point out how long the students had been able to go without getting suspended, or if they were suspended for a nonviolent rather than violent-related reason. We would ask what was going on in their lives to help them do that. That's a solution-focused technique in the middle of a different approach to working with the students. Inevitably, the students would describe a crisis in their life, and that the thing that helped them to get through it was the availability of a person, a parent, a teacher, a social worker, a counselor, a grandparent, that helped them deal with their experiences. So instead of focusing on what was wrong with the client and what caused the problem, the focus was on what was it that helped the client get through the problem longer without having a relapse. That's a clear solution-focused idea, although there are some others in solution-focused practice which I could leave out, but I won't go into that right now. And finally, CBT, cognitive behavioral. In this, use strategies, techniques designed to help the clients correct negative and distorted views about themselves and the future, and the maladaptive beliefs that give rise to these. A basic assumption of the interactional model is that there's a powerful interaction between how we feel and how we act, with how we act affecting how we feel. That's what cognitive behavioral approaches build on. Social learning theories. In cognitive behavioral treatment, the therapist helps the client identify and modify cognitive distortions, reinforces behaviors that are more adaptive for the client. The model also describes the existence of automatic thoughts, short pieces of internal dialogue that are associated with negative emotions and to lead to statements like, I am a failure. Here's an example, very brief, of how a group leader conducting a mutual aid support group, that's the model that I have worked with and developed over the years, integrates some understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy. The leader describes a patient and day treatment center which had so many groups that patients often felt grouped out. He surprised this social worker, in this case, by suggesting another group. She said, we need to talk about being mental patients, what it means, what it feels like. One patient after another seconded the motion. They wanted to address mental patient identity. How were they thought of in their families and neighborhoods? How should they think of themselves? Was the mental patient stigma justified? Where did it come from? What are its effects? Although their patienthood was at the heart of the patients had in common, it seemed to have remained an oppressive presence, at once too obvious and too painful to mention. Here's an example of a brief excerpt, again, in a mutual aid support group, but one that understands cognitive behavioral treatment. Sharon said, I had the leaves raked into piles. Then the wind blew them all around the yard again. I thought to myself, what's the use? They'll never get done. There will always be leaves. Then I went back to bed. My body started feeling heavy. I couldn't get out of bed. The counselor points out that Sharon had used the word always when speaking about her hospitalization. She had said, I'll always go back to the hospital. The counselor asked, is it true that there will always be leaves? Is the job never done? Sharon said that's one way of looking at it. I asked the group for other ways. Members suggested that Sharon should think about other tasks she has completed. In this model, CBT, that would be called disputation, disputing the idea. Nick said, maybe you have to redo the raking once or twice, maybe even 3 times, but not forever. Again, disputation. I mean, you do what you can, and then it snows and you're done. Everyone laughs. I repeated, you do what you can. Let me summarize. The rapid spread of interest in integrating EBPs and agencies require that supervisors develop at least a beginning understanding of its essential elements and some ideas of how to provide supervision of frontline workers, attempting to integrate core ideas into the practice. The examples discussed in this presentation included motivational interviewing, solution-focused treatment, cognitive behavioral treatment, and I suggested that elements from each of those could be used and integrated into another model of practice. One didn't have to practice according to a specific model. I want to repeat my caution about being concerned with conforming to treatment protocols and treatment integrity, that you don't have the ability to adapt things to fit specific populations and problems. In the case, the science would be restricting our artistry rather than increasing its effectiveness. Finally, the idea of the parallel process needs to be kept in mind, and supervisors and educators teach elements of an EBP. In one final example, I observed a trainer with a group of addiction counselors. Half of them were people who had professional degrees and were not in recovery. The other half were people in recovery without professional degrees. As the leader, the trainer, was presenting the stages of change for motivational interviewing, he immediately met resistance from both the professionals from the staff in recovery, who challenged his model of intervention that differed from their current approach. After the session, at which I was a silent viewer, he approached me, expressing his anger and frustration at the staff's angry response to his presentation. My response was to suggest to him that perhaps the staff were in the pre-contemplation stage while he was in the action stage. And through their behavior, they were actually showing him exactly what they experienced when they worked with their clients. He did not understand what I meant. Perhaps he was also in the pre-contemplation stage. I hope this presentation was helpful to you as you carry out your task of supervising workers in the use of evidence-based practices.